Hello and welcome. We are on lesson number 8. In lesson number 7, we started talking about agile planning, and the first topics that we discussed were three terms, which is your product backlog, product roadmap, and sprint backlog. Moving on, we'll talk about sprint planning and user story estimation. It's a big topic. We have a lot to unwrap here. So we will first talk about what is iteration planning, sprint planning, then we will dig deeper into story, feature, epic. What are these terms? What do they mean? Their relationship, story point estimation techniques, very important, and then a small topic of definition of done. So let's get started. What is sprint or iteration planning? So first of all, we talked about, if you remember the overall end-to-end cycle of Agile, sprint or iteration planning is done before start of every sprint. Now in the last lesson, we talked about sprint backlog. Sprint backlog is the work that the team is going to do in that sprint, and sprint planning is the activity where that backlog is created. Okay, so the team selects high priority items from product backlog, which is created by product owner. They pick items from that backlog for the next sprint. What do they do? What are the key activities? It's facilitated by Scrum Master. It define a clear sprint goal. For example, if you're building an app, so login creation will be a part of this sprint. So this is just one goal for that particular sprint. So that is identified, that is decided. Then break down features into stories. Hold on to this. Next section, we are going to talk about features and stories. What are they? So this is basically, for now, just understand that the list of things that they need to do, they break it down. Assign story points, user story estimation, entire topic in the next slide. It's coming. So they do that. And capacity planning, how is the team placed in terms of their capacity, who's available, who's not available, so that the workload can be divided accordingly. What is the output? We know that sprint or iteration planning is done to create a sprint backlog, which is a list of stories for the sprint. Stories are work items, and let's take a look at what this entire thing, how it ties together. At the top, you're seeing epic, then feature, and then features are broken down into stories. And stories, to complete the stories, you might have to do some activities. Those are your tasks. Now, what is an epic? At the top level, epic is a large body of work that can be broken down into multiple features or user stories. It represents a high level goal. Now, again, if you're building, say, an online banking application, so the epic will be the big items, represent high level goal or initiative. For example, improve the user login experience. So user login is your epic. Okay, it's a big item. Now feature, epic gets broken down into features. So your login experience was the epic. What will feature look like? It's a smaller component of epic. For example, add biometric login support. That will be your feature. So there's an epic, which is a bigger item, further broken down, feature, smaller portion of that item, and then come user stories. Story is the smallest chunk unit of that work. User story is a small specific requirement from the perspective of the end user. It describes a functionality or feature that delivers value to customer. Now, if you remember, if you have already gone through the predictive project management PMBOK guide material, then you know that there is a list of requirement that is created. Same thing, the requirements get translated into, in Agile, they are user stories. Now there is a fixed format to write user stories. As a user, I want this to do that. Look at this example here. As a customer, I want to reset my password so that I can regain access to my account. So who am I? I'm the customer. So the role, then the role of the user, and then what do they want to do? and why, to accomplish why. This is how user stories are written. Now, one thing that you need to understand, that to do this, to complete this user story, there may be further steps or tasks that need to be done to create that functionality of resetting the password. That is what the team will do. And when that is done, they will say that this user story is completed. Let's take a look at what user stories are again. User stories are small, actionable pieces of work that can be completed within a sprint. They focus on delivering specific benefit to the user. There is an this invest model. It's a mnemonic, or you can say acronym, for the characteristics of stories. What qualifies as a good story is, in this invest model, I stands for independent. Now, what do we mean by that? User story has to be independent. Now, say I want to log in with my credentials and reset my password. If you write a user story like this, that as a user I want to log in and reset my password. Now, if you look at it closely, you're putting two things together. So you're creating that dependency. The user story will not be completed until you work on the reset password and login, both the items. So it should not be the case. They shouldn't be tightly coupled together. They should be independent of each other. So in this case, there should be two user stories. One is that as a user, I want to log in with my credentials, and the second is as a user, I want to reset my password if I forget it. So that is the meaning of independent. Negotiable. It's not cast in stone that I have written this user story and nothing can change after that. No, it shouldn't be like that, because the value is in customer feedback, stakeholder feedback, so it should be open to discussion and adaptation. So when it's created, then you get more feedback from developers, testers, and then you should be able to change it. That's the meaning of negotiable. Valuable. It should make sense to the customer. Otherwise, what's the whole point of doing this? Estimatable. It should be measurable. You should be able to create an acceptance criteria, which we will talk about later. But when that story is done, you should be able to mark it complete. You should be able to assess that this is done. That is the meaning of estimatable. You should be able to understand how long will it take to complete this story. Okay, this is the meaning of estimatable. The last one, not the last one, second last one is small. It should be manageable. One story shouldn't go to 2-3 sprints. You should be able to do it in one sprint. If it's such a big story, you should break it down and make smaller stories out of it. Testable. It should have clear acceptance criteria to verify its completion. Imagine a user story like this: improve security. Now, what does that mean? You can't measure it. Instead, you should say, as a user, I want two-factor authentication to secure my account. Okay, so that is both estimatable and testable. And these are the few things which make your story a good story. Let's move on. What is story point estimation technique? Now, when agile teams are doing agile planning, they will pick up items from product backlog and they will decide how much they are going to complete in that sprint. Now, how will they know how much they can complete? One is their own resource availability, but the second, they should know how much effort will be required in completing this story. That assignment of effort, or that estimation of effort, is called story point estimation. Okay, let's try to understand it further. Story point estimation is the process of assigning story points to a product backlog item or a user story. Story points are measurable for understanding the effort that it will take to fully implement it. Estimation and story points are related to effort, not hours. If you give a weightage of 3 to a story point doesn't mean it'll take 3 hours to complete. It takes into account a lot of things like risk, complexity of the time, complexity of the work, amount of work it will need, and risk and uncertainty. So these are the three things that the team keeps in mind and assigns a point to a user story, which means how much effort will it take. Now there is a very important concept of relative estimation. Suppose you are moving into a new house. So you have packed all your items in boxes. Okay. Do you need, does the moving company, or if you are moving yourself, do you need to know the weight of each of the box? No. But you need to know small box, big box, large box. So relative as compared to one another, their size, this much information if you have, you will be able to assess how much space will it take. I don't know if that example really fits into what we are talking about here, but it's a similar approach here. Story point estimation is done relative to each other. That if this story has a point of 3 and this story has a point of 5, this one requires more effort than this one is more complicated than this. Let's look at what is written here. Instead of assigning exact hours, teams estimate using relative sizing, comparing one story's complexity to another. This provides a quick shared understanding of effort without overthinking. We will talk about the techniques and you will see how relative estimation is done. The first estimation technique that we are going to talk about is t-shirt sizing. You see different sizes of t-shirts here: small, medium, large, extra large. It is a very preliminary and easy way of uh, giving story points to the stories. If there are 5 stories, one is small, medium, large, so you can assess how much time they will take. Usually teams do this first and then they further get into mathematical ways of assigning more accurate values to stories, but this is like a first screening of stories and put them into categories: small, medium, large, etc. So this is one technique which is called t-shirt sizing. Now let's talk about planning poker, the most common technique. Planning poker, the teams assign points without looking at each other and then they agree and come to a conclusion. But most of the times, to assign those points, they use something called Fibonacci sequence. It's a mathematical concept. If you look at these words, actual Fibonacci sequence starts with 0, but you can't have a 0 story point. So it's modified for Agile: 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Now, what is the relationship that you are seeing in these numbers? This number is a result of addition of these two numbers. This number is a result of addition of these two numbers. This is Fibonacci sequence, and these are the numbers that are mostly used in planning poker. And this diagram simply shows that how this 5 is bigger than 3 and 8 is bigger than 5 and 13 is bigger and 21 is even much bigger. Now, what happens in planning poker? A team-based estimation technique using cards with numbers, and those cards have numbers which are in Fibonacci sequence. How is it done? Each team member selects a number privately. Everyone reveals their number like it happens in poker, and then they discuss. Okay, so one person has given, I have given one example also here. So there's one person who gave 3 points to one story. To the same story, the other person gave 8 and third person gave 5. Now they will discuss, okay, why did you give it a 5? Why did you give it an 8? And they'll agree and come to a consensus and then they will decide on a number. That is called planning poker. Now there's another method which is Wideband Delphi. Two things. that are new or different from the previous technique that we were talking about. One is that it's a group based estimation using expert opinion. That is one. Second, it's anonymous. Why is it anonymous? Because if nobody knows who's giving what number to a story, it prevents bandwagon effect, because it happens in a group that if one person does something, everybody, tends to do something similar. So group judgment happens. To avoid that, this technique uses anonymity to do the estimation. Hippo, highest paid person's opinion. If your manager is sitting and he says something, he or she says something, then you will tend towards their view because they are like the senior most in the group. So to avoid that, avoid group think. So that were three techniques that we talked about. Now we will talk about a smaller topic, which is acceptance criteria and definition of done. Acceptance criteria is nothing but a criterion to understand if the story is done. It relates back to the estimatable and testable characteristic of user stories. How will you know that this user story is accurately done? It defines what is required for a specific user story to be considered complete. For example, reset password email must expire within 24 hours. You'll test it, and if it is happening, that acceptance criteria is met. So user stories have acceptance criterion. Now there is something called definition of done, DOD. DOD is a shared understanding of what it means when work is considered complete. When the sprint is over, team will go into the sprint review and they will say that the work is done. Before saying that, there is a checklist that they will go through to make sure that the work is really done. So team comes together with stakeholders and definition of done is agreed upon. It's defined at the beginning of the project and applies globally to the project. Ensures consistency and clarity across the team. It's a crucial element for a successful Scrum software development process, but all other agile projects. Three things. Examples of definition of done. Unit and functional tests are complete. So unit test and functional test that the features are working properly, that is completed and passed, that is one example. All documentation is written and reviewed. Have you done that? So it's like a checklist. Every agile project will have a checklist which forms your definition of done. All acceptance criteria is met, code is written, tested, and integrated into the larger release pool. So that is your definition of done. So what all did we cover in this lesson? We talked about what is agile planning, sprint planning. Then we talked about user stories, epics, features, how the estimation is done, why the estimation is done, to assess how much effort will be needed to complete a story. And there is one more thing later on when we talk about agile metrics and measurement. Agile teams performance is also measured based on story points, so that is one more use of it. Then we talked about the estimation techniques, planning poker, wideband Delphi, and the t-shirt sizing one. And then we talked about acceptance criteria and definition of done. So this is it for this one. We will talk more about agile planning and measurement in the next lesson. Till then, bye. Thank you.